Hey everyone, welcome back to AI.Divine Insights. Today, we're going deep, like really deep.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You're here with us because you want to really get to the bottom of things. You don't want to wade through mountains of reading. You want the good
You
stuff.
want the core knowledge, the surprises, the things that'll make you stop and say, I never thought about it like that.
Exactly. And today we're diving into one of those foundational stories that has resonated for centuries. The story of manna from Exodus chapter 16.
We're going to unpack this passage from the New King James Version. Because this isn't just an ancient tale, right?
It's not. It's about a community facing a real crisis.
Yeah.
It's about provision. And it's about how we respond to both, when things are tough and when we're given help.
That's it. We're hoping to explore this in a way that's clear, that's engaging, that'll maybe spark some new thoughts for you.
Let's jump right in. So we find the Israelites on the move again. They've left Elim, that oasis with the 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they're now in the wilderness of sin.
The wilderness of sin. Yeah, it's kind of a loaded name, isn't it? I mean, just geographically, it's that in-between place, isn't it? They've left the relative comfort of Elim behind, but they haven't reached Sinai yet, which is their ultimate goal, where they're going to receive the law.
Right. The timing here is really crucial too, right? Because this is about a month and a half after they left Egypt. So that initial excitement of escaping, you can imagine it's starting to fade, and the reality of wandering in the desert is setting in.
Absolutely. And the desert, I mean, it's not exactly known for its five-star accommodation, so it's in this stark environment that we start to hear a very human sound complaining.
And this wasn't just a little grumbling here and there. The text says, the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. So this is a pretty unified chorus of discontent.
Oh, it is. And their complaint is so raw, so visceral. They say, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. They're conjuring up this really powerful image of those pots of meat.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because they're saying they'd rather be back in Egypt, even as slaves, as long as they had those regular meals. It makes you realize the psychological pull of the familiar, even when that familiar wasn't all that great. It's like they're saying we'd rather be fed slaves than starving free people.
Exactly. And I mean, talk about a tough position for Moses and Aaron to be in, right?
Yeah.
Facing that level of disillusionment.
For sure. So what's the Lord's response to this outpouring of complaint?
Well, it's pretty dramatic. The Lord says to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. Talk about an unexpected delivery method. But it's not just about filling empty stomachs. There's a deeper purpose at play here.
Right, there's a condition. It's not just a free handout. What's the purpose the Lord states for sending this bread from heaven?
He says it's that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. This daily bread, then, becomes an ongoing test of their willingness to follow God's instructions.
What do you think this daily gathering was designed to reveal about their relationship with God?
Well, on the surface, it's about obedience. But it goes deeper than that, right?
It does.
I mean, were they going to trust that the provision would come again tomorrow? Were they willing to put in the effort, to follow the routine?
And then, the instruction for the sixth day hints at something else, too.
Oh, absolutely. Verse 5, it tells us that on the sixth day, they were supposed to gather twice as much manna and prepare it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the first real hints we get about the Sabbath, the concept of resting on the seventh day.
Hmm.
And I find it really interesting how this fundamental practice gets introduced right here in the context of this miraculous food supply.
Yeah. So following this divine promise of provision, Moses and Aaron address the people. What's the tone they take and what's the main message they want to get across?
Well, they're walking a fine line, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to reassure the people, but they're also trying to get them to refocus. They say, at evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord.
Yeah.
They're reminding the Israelites that God is actively involved in their lives and promising an even greater display of his presence.
And Moses, he really drives home the point about who their complaints are truly directed at.
Oh, he does. He says to them, what are we that you complain against us? And then clarifies, your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord.
Yeah.
So he's making a really crucial distinction here. Their frustration with their circumstances, it's being framed as a deeper questioning of God's plan and provision.
So after that, he goes on to echo God's promise, right? The promise of meat in the evening and bread in the morning, a double reassurance.
Exactly. And as Aaron is speaking to the people, something pretty incredible happens.
Pretty incredible.
It's a huge moment. The text says, "As Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud."
Wow. I mean, imagine that, seeing this visual manifestation of God's presence right there in the middle of their struggle. It must have been a powerful moment for them.
Oh, absolutely. And then God actually speaks directly to Moses again, confirming that promise once more.
What does he say?
He says, "At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God."
It's like he's putting his stamp of approval on this whole thing.
And the very next thing that happens is the fulfillment of the first part of that promise.
Right. Like clockwork, it says. So it was that quail came up at evening and covered the camp. Just like that, the promised meat arrived. It's a form of sustenance they would have recognized, something familiar. But the next morning, they wake up to something completely new.
Completely new and mysterious.
Mm.
So how does this bread from heaven actually arrive? What does it look like? Well, the text describes it like this. When the layer of dew lifted, there, on the surface of the wilderness, was a small, round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So picture this delicate, unexpected substance just appearing all over the desert floor after the morning dew evaporates.
I mean, that must have been a pretty strange sight for them. No wonder their first reaction is pure confusion.
Right. They look at it and ask, "What is it?" Or in Hebrew, "Man who?" The text even tells us, "For they did not know what it was."
It's like they're looking at it, scratching their heads and saying, what is this stuff? And that question, that man who, that becomes its name.
It's actually kind of funny when you think about it.
It is. And then, of course, Moses steps in to explain what it is.
Yeah, he lays it out for them. He says, "This is the bread which the Lord is giving you to eat." He connects it directly back to God's promise, makes it clear that this is a gift, their daily provision.
And then he gives them some very specific guidelines on how they're supposed to gather this manna.
Oh, yes. The rules of manna gathering. So what were the ground rules?
Well, the command is pretty clear. Let every man gather according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person. An omer, by the way, was a standard dry measure at the time. It's roughly equivalent to about 4 to 5 pints. So they're supposed to gather enough for each person in their household. It even says, let every man take for those who are in his tent.
Okay, so they had their instructions, but did everyone actually follow them? I mean, did everyone gather the same amount?
Well, some people just can't resist pushing the boundaries, can they?
It's human nature, right?
It is. The text tells us, so the children of Israel did so, and some gathered more, some less. It makes you wonder, did the ones who gathered more end up with a surplus?
Right. Did they end up with a stockpile of manna?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. When they measured what they had collected, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. It's like this built-in system for fairness.
It's wild. So it wasn't about how much effort you put in or how much you tried to hoard. It was about everyone having just enough.
It's a powerful lesson in trusting God's provision and recognizing that we all have enough. But there's a catch, right? They're given this daily supply, but there's a very specific rule about what they can't do.
The "thou shalt not" of manna was the big no-no.
Moses lays down the law. He says, let no one leave any of it till morning.
That's a bold statement, right?
Yeah, because you have to remember they're in the middle of the wilderness and this is their only source of food. So not saving any for later is a huge test of faith.
So it's not just about gathering the right amount. It's about trusting that God will provide again the next day.
It's about letting go of that need to control, to stockpile. And some of them, well, they couldn't quite resist the urge to hold on, could they?
So what happened when they tried to stash away some manna for later?
Well, let's just say it didn't go so well. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank.
Oh, yuck. Yeah, that's a pretty vivid image. It really underscores the importance of trusting God and following his instructions. And Moses was not pleased about this little act of rebellion.
Not at all. So what kind of routine did they establish around this manna? What did their day-to-day look like?
So every morning they'd wake up and they'd gather just what they needed for that day.
Right.
And there was also this really interesting natural limitation. The text tells us when the sun became hot, it melted. So even if someone tried to gather a little extra, it wouldn't last.
It's a good system, right? It really emphasized that daily dependence on God. You can't get ahead, and you don't need to.
And then the story circles back to the special instructions for the Sabbath. Remember, on the sixth day, they were told to do something different.
Right. They were told to gather twice as much manna, 2 omers per person.
Exactly. And when the leaders saw everyone doing this, they went to Moses, probably a little confused. Maybe they thought people were breaking the rules.
So what did Moses say to them?
Moses explains that this is all part of God's plan. He says, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourself all that remains, to be kept until morning."
Wow. So this is like the formal introduction of the Sabbath, this day of rest dedicated to the Lord, and it's tied directly to this miraculous provision of manna.
And the test of obedience continues because they're told to do something they weren't allowed to do on other days.
They were told to save some of the manna.
Right, so they put it aside, just as Moses instructed, and guess what?
What?
They laid it up till morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it.
It's a miracle.
I know, it's completely different from what happened when they tried to save it on other days. It really emphasizes the special nature of the Sabbath.
So what were they supposed to do with this manna they'd saved?
Moses gave them very clear instructions. He said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none."
So they have their 6 days of work, gathering manna each day, and then the Sabbath, a day of rest where God's provision from the previous day sustains them.
It's a beautiful rhythm. But even after all this, even after seeing the manna go bad when they disobeyed, some people still couldn't resist testing the boundaries.
Oh no, really? They tried to gather manna on the Sabbath.
Yeah, it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. Talk about a lesson in trusting God and respecting the Sabbath.
And how did God respond to this?
God, I think, was getting a little frustrated at this point. He questions Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" He's really emphasizing that the Sabbath isn't optional. This is a direct command.
Oh, for sure.
And he goes on to say, "See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you on the sixth day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day."
So he's really making it crystal clear, all right? This is how it's going to be.
And it seems like this time the message finally got through.
Yeah.
Because the text tells us, so the people rested on the seventh day.
Finally. So after all this, the story kind of circles back to this mysterious substance itself and gives it a formal name.
It's about time. So what did they decide to call this? Bread from heaven.
Well, they decided to keep it simple. The House of Israel called its name manna, and we actually get a slightly clearer description of what it was like.
Tell me more.
They say it was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So small, pale, and sweet. We still don't know exactly what it was, but at least we have a bit more of a sensory picture now.
Yeah. It gives you a little something to work with, right? So what happens next?
Well, Moses is given a pretty significant command. He's told to preserve a portion of this manna.
Why? What was the point of that?
God tells Moses to put an omer of manna in a jar to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt. He wants future generations to see this physical reminder of how he took care of their ancestors.
So it's this tangible historical marker, a reminder of God's faithfulness.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a suggestion either. They actually did it.
They put it in a jar.
Mm-hmm. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron laid it up before the testimony to be kept.
Wow. So they really made sure this physical representation of their sustenance would be preserved.
Amazing. And then the passage wraps up by telling us 2 more important pieces of information: how long this manna situation went on for, and the official definition of that omer measurement we've been talking about.
Yeah, they ate manna for a long time. It says the children of Israel ate manna 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan.
40 years.
40 years of this miraculous daily bread.
It is. And then it clarifies, just so there's no confusion. Now, an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. The ephah was another bigger dry measure, roughly like a half a bushel. So an omer was just a smaller unit within their system of measurement.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Exodus 16. So what stood out to you the most?
You know, for me, it's the threefold lesson this story teaches. First, that God provides, even when things seem completely hopeless. They were starving and this unexpected food just appeared. Second, this provision is always tied to obedience and trust. They had to follow God's instructions to receive the manna, and they had to trust that he would provide each day.
Right. It wasn't a free-for-all.
Nope. And third, the story establishes the Sabbath as a rhythm of rest, something that's intimately connected to God's provision. They work for 6 days, trusting in God's daily supply of manna, and then they rest on the seventh, nourished by what God has already given.
It's incredible when you think about it, the way this manna worked. It showed up every day. It met their needs perfectly, no more, no less, when gathered correctly, and then it even behaved differently on the Sabbath. It's just this really beautiful, ongoing symbol of God's care and power sustaining them in the wilderness.
It makes you wonder about the manna in our own lives, doesn't it? What are those unexpected blessings, those sources of support that we rely on without even realizing it? I think it's worth considering how we too are often dependent on things outside our control, things we might not fully understand for both our daily needs and our overall journey.
That's a great thought to end on.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
See you next time.
Also, please like and subscribe to AI.Divine Insights for daily podcast episodes.
See you next time.